In the 1980s, when I used to go to Lebanon quite often while things were terrible out there, I met a man in the 70s actually by the name of Sammy Dagger. Sammy Dagger is yay high. Probably makes John Wesley look like he plays for basketball or something like that. You know, he's a tiny little teddy bear of a guy. But he expends more energy in saying good morning than most people would in a whole sermon. How are you, my friend? Yeah, that's what he talks. He got caught in North Carolina for going through a red light, and you know what he told the police officer when he was visiting his son? He said, Mr. Officer, in Beirut, when we see a red light, we think it's Christmas time. That's Sammy Dagger. So Sammy knows no fear, and that's the problem. I was thrown with him going through the country, and he knew no fear. And so his wife, who's English, Joy, they were telling me this story. He was driving at 11 o'clock at night during curfew. Everybody else is home. Sammy is driving to visit somebody. And as he's driving, he sees a suitcase on the side of the road. Now, you don't pick up a suitcase on the side of any road, particularly in Beirut. And he looks at Joy and says, darling, there is a suitcase on the side of the road. She says, Sammy, I can see it. And it's not ours. Let's keep going. He says, but it is somebody's. He pulls up and he pats it. He says, it's full. She says, Sammy, please leave it and let's go home. You know. And he says, no, somebody has lost it. So he lifts this thing, puts it in the trunk of his car. And if I were him, I'd walk home, but I wouldn't go with him. You know, he drives it back, goes there, opens the lock, opens it, packed to every square inch with money. Nobody ever has that experience and says, why me, Lord? So he looks at that, empties it out, and there's a business card. And he calls the man. He says, have you lost anything? The man pauses and says, have you found it? Man is shocked. He says, I'm coming right now. He said, look, it's curfew. If I had any other plans for this, I wouldn't be calling you. You come tomorrow, I'll give it to you. So the man comes the next day, and he's staring at Sammy. He can't believe this. Who is this man who's turned in all this suitcase full of money? And so finally he puts his hand in, takes that and says, here, you're a pastor, give this to the church. Sammy says, we take that on Sunday morning, you come and put it in. So he invites the guy, he comes in on Sunday, and he couldn't believe what he heard, couldn't believe what he saw, music, song, praise. He said, I want to bring my whole family to meet you. I happened to be there that day when he came. That's how I know the story. Sammy was going to take me back to the boat so that I could go to Cyprus. The airport was closed at that time. And this man comes with his wife and his children to meet a man who had such honor. You know what Sammy says to him? You think you got all your treasure back. That's what you think. I want you to know this is nothing. Moth and rust are going to corrupt this. He said, have you ever wondered how many people outside of Beirut are looking for Lebanese money? You thought you had your riches. He said, I'll give you the thing that is the greatest treasure of all. And he gave him a Bible. He said, read it, study it, give your life to Jesus Christ. This is his word. This is the word of God. The guy sitting there with tears running down his face as I'm being told in interpretation what is being said. He takes the Bible, kisses it, won't take it away from his lips because he's just met a man who lived it out and demonstrated that's where the treasure really lies. You do not live by bread alone, but by every word that proceeds from the mouth of God.
was around 1971. I was a brand new Christian. I'd just come to faith on my high school campus, and I was attending Calvary Chapel in Costa Mesa. And I heard that I am supposed to go out now and start sharing my faith. I wasn't a year old in my new beliefs. I wasn't 6 months old. I think I was probably a couple of weeks old. But I thought, I know enough to go out and tell others about Jesus. You know, sometimes ignorance is bliss, right? And so I went down to the beach. I think it was Huntington Beach, as I recall. I was armed with my Bible, of course, and a copy of the 4 Spiritual Laws that was put up by Campus Crusade for Christ. I was so new to all of this, I hadn't even memorized the contents of the little Bible tract quite yet. And so I was looking for someone to talk to about Jesus, and I saw this lady about the age of my mom sitting on the beach by herself, and I thought, you know, maybe she'll listen to me. She'll be kind to me because I'm so young, you know. And I walked up. You have to understand, I had long hair. I had hair to start with. I had long hair at this point, and I walked up. My voice was shaking. I said, hi, do you mind if I talk to you a little bit about Jesus? And she said, no, go ahead. And I said, okay. And I sat down, and I just started reading the contents of this little tract. The 4 Spiritual Laws, copyright 1954, Campus Crusade. And I just turned to page 1. God loves you and there's a wonderful plan for your life. And I just started reading through this. And here's what I'm thinking as I'm reading. This is not going to work. Well, who do I think I am out here talking to someone about Jesus as if this woman would actually believe as a result of my foolish attempts to convince her about her need for Christ? And I was reading through this page by page, thinking these thoughts of doubt as I'm saying these words, and I would look up at her periodically, and she was just looking at me, and I thought, you know, this isn't really going well at all. I can hardly wait till I'm done. I got to the very end of the little track, and there's a question that you are to ask, or the person reading it would read the question, and the question is there any good reason why you should not accept Jesus? So I read that. Is there any good reason why you should not accept Jesus right now? I looked up. She said, no. Okay, no. Are you saying you want to accept Jesus? She said, yes. I had planned for failure, not success. And so in the most reverent tone I could muster, I said, let's bow our heads for a word of prayer together, you know. And she closed her eyes, and I'm frantically searching this thing for a prayer. What do I do now? I found a little prayer at the end, and to show you how lacking in faith I was, as I was leading her in the prayer for her to accept Christ, I was thinking, this isn't going to work. But when we're done praying and she said, amen, she said, something just changed inside of me. And I said, yeah, something just changed inside of me too. I just realized that God could use someone like me.
spoke of the disjoint nature between the public and private life, and I'm in agreement with you in as much as if you have a passion in your private life, that should overflow in your public life,
right.
as to not like destroy yourself.
That's right.
What do you think we can do as a Christian community and body to
Yeah.
better love our fellow human beings and just to reach out to them on a more co-planar level rather than a more
Adversarial type thing.
like a complex like we're better than you
Yeah.
or any
Agreed.
view of that?
I appreciate that. Well, one of the reasons I have hope in this thing is precisely because of people like you who are in universities, professors who are at universities who are followers of Christ. You know, this is part of the price we pay for the way we abused the times when we had freedoms to do that and sort of collared people and pounded them into belief. I mean, you do not enforce a community of faith with the methods that we have used. You know, recently I was asked to speak at the Mormon Tabernacle in Salt Lake City, Utah. I was there, the first evangelical they'd asked in 100 years. In 1899, D.L. Moody spoke there. You should have seen some of the vitriolic letters that I got from very pious people. I got more books on the subject than I ever wanted to collect. My library has increased tremendously. And I say to myself, why such outrage by a community of grace? It didn't make sense to me. And my answer was, hey, I have spoken across chasms of belief all my life. I'm not going to change now. I said, you want to throw me into some other horrific worldview, I'll put my hand up first and say, I'm going to go. The Christian has to learn that it is not only his or her message, but also his or her method. If the method is in violation of the message, the people see it very quickly. I have found more people objecting to the Christian than they really do to Jesus Christ. When you exalt the beauty of Christ, I tell you what, no one ever lived like him. No one ever spoke like him. No one was ever so compassionate to sinners as he was. No one ever welcomed the outcasts as he did. He set the law on a higher plane, but his mercy was also in proportion in keeping with it. He knows how to humble us without humiliating us and how to lift us up without flattering us. He gives you the true essential nature of your worth. There are places and settings in which you stand up and defend the faith. There are places and settings in which you know it is inappropriate to be doing it here. And so I say to you, the way you do it is exactly in settings like this. Look, I'm honored. When I come to a place like this, I die a couple of deaths before I come. Why? What am I going to say to 2,000 to 3,000 people? To take 2 hours of their time? And I just go on my knees and say, Lord, I'm not worthy of this. But the fact that you are here is at least out of a courtesy to say, we want to hear what you have to say about such important issues. And in settings like this where you debate or have open forums, in sitting around a table and discussing, in England we go into the pubs and the bar rooms till 11 and 12 at night. In India, I speak to the film actors community. This year I'm to speak to the political community. Last year I had the privilege of addressing the United Nations. People are hungry. It's how we do it. And sometimes we blow it. Sometimes I've walked away and said, I ought not to have put it that way. So just be wise, be careful, and God will honor your faith. There's a recent article in the New York Times which says God is dead. We need to be dancing on his grave. He doesn't know there's nobody in that grave.
a number of years ago in a Baptist church in Crystal Palace in southern London. The Sunday morning service was closing, and a stranger stood up at the back, raised his hand. He said, "Excuse me, Pastor, can I share a little testimony?" The pastor looked at his watch. He said, "You've got 3 minutes." And this man proceeded. He said, "I've just moved into this area. I used to live in another part of London. I came from Sydney in Australia. And just a few months back, I was visiting some relatives. And I was walking down George Street. You know where George Street is in Sydney? It runs from the business hub out to the Rocks, the colonial area. And he said, a strange little white-haired man stepped out of a shop doorway, put a pamphlet in my hand, and he said, "Excuse me, sir, are you saved? If you die tonight, are you going to heaven?" He said, I was astounded by those words. Nobody had ever told me that. I thanked him courteously, and all the way on British Airlines back to Heathrow, this puzzled me. I called a friend who lived in this new area where I'm living now, and thank God he was a Christian. He led me to Christ, and I'm a Christian, and I want a fellowship here. And Baptists love testimonies like it. Everyone applauded and welcomed him into the fellowship. That Baptist pastor flew to Adelaide in Australia the next week, and 10 days later, in the middle of a 3-day series in a Baptist church in Adelaide, a woman came to him for counseling, and he wanted to establish where she stood with Christ. And she said, "I used to live in Sydney. And just a couple of months back, I was visiting friends in Sydney, doing some last-minute shopping down George Street, and a strange little white-haired man, elderly man, stepped out of a shop doorway, offered me a pamphlet, and said, 'Excuse me, ma'am, are you saved? If you die tonight, are you going to heaven?'" She said, I was disturbed by those words. When I got back to Adelaide, I knew this Baptist church was on the next block from me, and I sought out the pastor, and he led me to Christ. So, sir, I'm telling you that I am a Christian. Now, this London pastor was now very puzzled. Twice, within a fortnight, he'd heard the same testimony. He then flew to preach in the Mount Pleasant Baptist Church in Perth. And when his teaching series was over, the senior elder of that church took him out for a meal. And he said, "Mate, how'd you get saved?" He said, "I grew up in this church from the age of 15 through Boys Brigade. Never made a commitment to Jesus, just hopped on the bandwagon like everybody else. And because of my business ability, grew up to a place of influence. I was on a business outing in Sydney just 3 years ago, and an obnoxious, spiteful little man stepped out of a shop doorway, offered me a religious pamphlet, cheap junk, and accosted me with a question. 'Excuse me, sir, are you saved? If you die tonight, are you going to heaven?' He said, I tried to tell him I was a Baptist elder. He wouldn't listen to me. He said, I was seething with anger all the way home on Qantas to Perth. He said, I told my pastor thinking he would sympathize with me, and my pastor agreed. He had been disturbed for years, knowing that I didn't have a relationship with Jesus, and he was right. And my pastor led me to Jesus just 3 years ago. Now, this London preacher flew back to the UK and was speaking at the Keswick Convention in the Lake District. And he threw in these 3 testimonies. At the close of his teaching session, 4 elderly pastors came up and said, we got saved between 25 and 35 years ago, respectively, through that little man on George Street giving us a tract and asking us that question. He then flew the following week to a similar Keswick Convention in the Caribbean, to missionaries. And he shared the testimonies. At the close of his teaching session, 3 missionaries came up and said, we got saved between 15 and 25 years ago, respectively, through that little man's testimony and asking us that same question on George Street in Sydney. Coming back to London, he stopped outside Atlanta, Georgia, to speak at a naval chaplains convention. And when his 3 days of revving these naval chaplains up, over 1,000 of them, in soul winning, the chaplain general took him out for a meal. And he said, how did you become a Christian? He said, well, it was miraculous. I was a rating on a United States battleship, and I lived a reprobate life. We were doing exercises in the South Pacific, and we docked in Sydney Harbour for replenishments. We hit King's Cross with a vengeance. I got blind drunk. I got on the wrong bus, got off in George Street, and as I got off the bus, I thought it was a ghost. This elderly white-haired man jumped in front of me, pushed a pamphlet in my hand and said, sailor, are you saved? If you die tonight, you're going to heaven. He said, the fear of God hit me immediately. I was shocked sober and ran back to the battleship, sought out the chaplain. The chaplain led me to Christ. And I soon began to prepare for the ministry under his guidance. And here I am in charge of over 1,000 chaplains, and we're bent on soul winning today. That London preacher, 6 months later, flew to do a convention for 5,000 Indian missionaries in a remote corner of northeastern India. And at the end, the Indian missionary in charge, a humble little man, took him home to his humble little home for a simple meal. And he said, how did you, as a Hindu, come to Christ? He said, I was in a very privileged position. I worked for the Indian diplomatic mission. And I traveled the world. And I am so glad for the forgiveness of Christ and his blood covering my sin, because I'd be very embarrassed if people found out what I got into. He said, one bout of diplomatic service took me to Sydney. And I was doing some last-minute shopping laden with parcels of toys and clothing for my children, walking down George Street. And this courteous little white-haired man stepped out in front of me, offered me a pamphlet, and said, "Excuse me, sir, are you saved? If you die tonight, are you going to heaven?" He said, I thanked him very much, but this disturbed me. I got back to my town, I sought out the Hindu priest, and he couldn't help me. But he gave me some advice. He said, just to satisfy your curious mind, nothing else, go and talk to the missionary in the mission house at the end of the road. And that was fatal advice. He said, because that day the missionary led me to Christ, I quit Hinduism immediately, and then began to study for the ministry. I left the diplomatic service, and here I am, by God's grace, in charge of all these missionaries, and we are winning hundreds of thousands of people to Christ. Well, 8 months later, that Crystal Palace Baptist pastor was ministering in Sydney, in Gymea, southern suburb of Sydney. And he said to the Baptist minister, do you know a little man, an elderly little man who witnesses and hands out tracts on George Street? And he said, I do. His name is Mr. Genor, G-E-N-O-R. But I don't think he does it anymore. He's too frail and elderly. The man said, I want to meet him. 2 nights later, they went around to this little apartment, knocked on the door, and this tiny, frail little man opened the door. He sat them down, made them some tea, and he was so frail he was slopping tea into the saucer as he shook. And as he sat with them, this London preacher told him all these accounts over the previous 3 years. This little man sat with tears running down his cheeks. He said, my story goes like this. He said, I was a rating on an Australian warship, and I lived a reprobate life, and in a crisis, I really hit the wall, and one of my colleagues, whom I gave literal hell, was there to help me. He led me to Jesus, and the change in my life was night to day in 24 hours. And I was so grateful to God. I promised God that I would share Jesus in a simple witness with at least 10 people a day, as God gave me strength. Sometimes I was ill, I couldn't do it, but I made up for it for other times. I wasn't paranoid about it, but I have done this for over 40 years, and in my retirement years, the best place was on George Street. There were hundreds of people. I got lots of rejections. But a lot of people courteously took the tracts. And he said, in 40 years of doing this, I've never heard of one single person coming to Jesus until today. Do you know, I would say that has to be commitment. That has to be just sheer gratitude and love for Jesus to do that, not hearing of any results. Margarita did a little count. That's 146,100 people. That simple little non-charismatic Baptist man influenced somehow to Jesus. And I believe what God was showing that Baptist minister was the tip of the tip of the tip of the tip of this iceberg. Goodness knows how many more had been arrested for Christ and were doing huge jobs out in the mission field. Mr. Genor died 2 weeks later. And can you imagine the reward he went home to in heaven? I doubt if his face would ever have appeared on Charisma magazine. I doubt if there would ever have been a write-up with a photograph in Billy Graham's Decision magazine, as beautiful as those magazines are. Nobody except a little group of Baptists in southern Sydney knew about Mr. Genor. But I'll tell you, his name was famous in heaven. Heaven knew Mr. Genor. And you can imagine the welcome and the red carpet and the fanfare he went home to when he arrived in glory.
welcome to Rock. What is your name?
My name is Darman Hoffman. I'm from Columbus, Nebraska.
And what kind of things do you do for outreach?
Well, we work with Laborers for Christ, which is a group of retired people who help churches build their buildings, and it gives opportunity to share my faith with members of the congregation as well as people in the community. Whenever we go to a store or something, I'll strike up a conversation with somebody, and we'll get the conversation kind of moving over to faith life and what our relationship is with Christ.
So you're doing outreach both organizational and personal.
I think it's always personal. Even if you're part of an organization, it has to be personal. You can't rely on an organization to do anything. It's the people in the organization, and it's an individual. It's individual contact with another individual, a one-on-one sharing your faith and giving witness to what God has done for you.
And what do you hope to gain from Rock?
I hope to pick up a few ideas and a few pointers and ways to do that better.
Well, great. Thank you. Thanks for coming.
Thank you.